this episode of China Unscripted. Was there election fraud in South Korea? Was China involved? And what could it mean for the future of the U.S., Korea, and China? Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Chong.
And I'm Matt Ganeshta.
Joining us today is Grant Newwshan, a retired U.S. colonel and research fellow at the Center for Security Policy. Grant, thanks for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks very much.
So, before we talk about China's possible involvement in the South Korean election, I think we need to talk about the election itself. So there are allegations of fraud in the April 15th South Korean election, enough to swing the election in favor of the ruling Democratic Party. That's a pretty big claim. What evidence is there for it?
Well, it is a big claim. You're right about that. Anytime an election is not honest, it of course gets one's attention, but it's also a big charge. The evidence, and before I get into that, I'll say that I started off as a skeptic when I started looking into this issue of the April 15th National Assembly election in Korea. That I, was kind of doubtful, because I think we all remember that picture of Harry Truman holding up that picture, the newspaper, which says on the headline, "Dewey beats Truman." And elections turn out in strange ways all the time that leave people really disappointed and surprised, etc. So I just thought that was, I thought that might be what it was going to turn out to be, but I was curious to see what sort of evidence there was. And once I started looking into it, and particularly once I started talking to the people who had raised the charges, I started to change my opinion, my mind, and these were all very level-headed people. And they were not overreaching. They were sticking with the particular evidence and information that they had found and uncovered. And so instead of finding myself at like a UFO convention, I was actually surrounded by very serious, genuine people, many of them eminent in their professions, and this mix of lawyers, statisticians, computer experts, mathematicians, a few politicians. You even had one former leftist. And you had just a range of regular citizens. And it made an impression on me. So I came to the conclusion that substantial likelihood that there was some manipulation in the election. Now what specifically was you had a very simple electoral network from an electronic perspective, and some of the computer experts, the technical guys that looked into this, looked at the system, looked at the hardware, looked at the electronic counting machines, the things that count the ballots, and they all said, well, these were very easily hacked, and there were some questions about why they were designed the way they were, particularly inside the counting machines. You had QR codes on the early ballots, and the Korean system is a little unusual. Well, not unusual, but a peculiarity is that it has something called early voting, which means that people can vote 4 or 5 days before the election. There's 2 days of early voting, and you can go vote. And then if you want to vote on election day, then people just go on election day. And the early voting, when you go in, you get a ballot that's printed out, and it has a QR code on it. And it's only those ballots that have QR codes on them. And the presence of a QR code on a ballot is suspicious in its own right. Additionally, you had huge problems with the chain of custody. Once a ballot is put in a box, and then getting it to where it needs to go to be counted, just huge cases of this where nobody quite knows how they got where they were going. You had them stored in improper boxes, like from a bakery box. You had seals that had been broken, and all of this, these citizens had uncovered evidence of it, photographic evidence as well. And then you had some statisticians who looked at the actual voting patterns, and they said, well, this doesn't make sense. And it was the early voting that was particularly suspect when compared to election day. And one bit of evidence is that on early voting, the Moon administration, the incumbent, they got about 11-12% more votes than on election day voting. And
Really?
for the early voting, the opposition got about 11 or 12% fewer votes than on election day. And the thing was reversed for election day voting. And normally the spread is about 2 to 3%, according to statisticians. So that was curious. And one of the people that I talked to, who was a former president of the Korean version of MIT, he sort of laughed and he described this as the results as artistic. And he said, like, either God did it or it was rigged. You had another equally eminent person who described it as flipping a coin 1,000 times and coming up with heads every time. And then you had other sort of bits of information. One person actually looked at the voting speeds in one given site over a certain period of time, and he figured out that there would have had to been a vote cast every 1.7 seconds, and that is highly improbable.
You mean 1.7 seconds in one location?
That's right. It was they took one location he took a 1 hour period during the afternoon, and he looked at the number of votes that went through and the number of machines, and it comes out to about 1.7. If that many votes were in fact cast, it would have been about 1.7 seconds for everyone that was voted. And once again, it's that early voting stage which seems to be where the real suspicion lies compared to the election day voting. And you had other things like it said that in the early voting sites, the CCTV cameras were covered up to protect personal privacy. But on election day voting, the cameras were said not to be covered up at voting sites, which once again, something that kind of makes you a little suspicious. And then a very eminent South Korean lawyer actually, he took a look at how the early votes that had been cast in so-called out of district, because you can vote anywhere in Korea, or if it's early, and if it's not your district, you put the ballot into an envelope and it gets mailed to your district where it's then counted. He actually went to the trouble of looking into the delivery records of 2 million plus of these mail-in ballots, and once again, that didn't make sense. What he found was very interesting. He noted that there was about 1 million of them, of the ballots, that something was wrong. And one thing that really jumped out at him was the delivery the patterns, because you can actually track where a ballot, how it's moved. And you had the equivalent of these votes allegedly, say you wanted to go from New York over to Newark. Say you did the South Korean equivalent of that, you had votes that would do the equivalent of going from New York up to Buffalo, over to Rochester, back to Buffalo, down to New York, and over to Newark. And there was a lot of these, and then you had problems with the actually recorded delivery information. A lot of them simply weren't delivered. But there's a range of things that really cast serious doubt on about 1 million ballots. And this was another bit of information that really gets your attention, when you put all this together. And so that was, I say, what sort of caused me to change my mind. And you heard this from the people you heard it from. Were, as I said, if you talk to them, these were very level-headed people.
Well, so I noticed you mentioned citizens uncovered this, statisticians, but you never mentioned anything about any media investigation into these claims.
No, there hasn't been much, if any, other than just a most cursory examination of it. And part of the problem is that the Moon administration has been very tough on the South Korean media. And to people who criticize the Moon administration, they use their full range of intimidatory powers. This can be regulatory authority over broadcasting companies, over the media. And South Korean libel laws are very strict. Truth is not a defense. And that'll intimidate a reporter. Also,
But sorry, let me just go back to this. So, truth is not a defense, meaning that if you say something about someone that's true, but it hurts them or causes some sort of material damage to their reputation or makes them lose their job or whatever, they can sue you even though what you said is 100% true?
That's right. And there can even be criminal liability for this.
Wow.
As I understand the law, if the way you can get away, you can not get in trouble, is if it's in the public interest, and that's a pretty broad interpretation. And also a very narrow one.
Election rigging is not in the public interest.
Well, who gets to decide what is and what isn't in the public interest?
Well, that's generally the government, but it's a problem, and it was really sort of put a stiletto into free speech in Korea, as one observer put it. I believe that there is one benefit if it's true. I believe the prison sentence is only 3 years, and if it's not true, then it's 7.
So the Moon administration is basically saying it's not in the public interest to see if the Moon administration rigged the election. That's convenient.
Even before the election, they have been very, very tough on people who criticize them. There was one case, I think it was in about 2019, where a number of people, including some journalists, raised some complaints or questions about where President Moon was for 5 hours during a very major forest fire. And they all had charges brought against them. And that was, so this goes well beyond thin skin, I would say. I would suggest it is more than that. But the Moon administration's efforts long before the election to rein in and, one would say, suppress the Korean media were pretty obvious and serious, but they didn't get much attention. But that's one of the reasons why the South Korean media hasn't really covered the issue much. But also another very simple reason is to investigate a charge of election fraud. It's complicated, and it takes a lot of investigative work. It's a tough issue for a reporter, just as it is for anyone. As for the foreign media's lack of interest, well, that's just harder to understand. Once again, it is a complicated thing. There are reporters who are generally pro-Moon or sympathetic to Moon. That could be a reason for not going after it. But it remains a sort of a puzzling sort of thing to my way of thinking, that it hasn't gotten the media attention that it deserves. But I think, as everyone knows, there's not a whole lot of investigative reporters around these days, just the way the media business has been affected. So in the past, say somebody might have sent a reporter to Korea for as long as it takes to figure out the story. But these days, newsrooms are pretty small. So that would be one charitable way to look at it. But also, it's a puzzling lack of interest.
Well, I think one thing is, this is happening, April 15th was an election, so basically the whole world is in the middle of the coronavirus. I can see how this might have seemed like this story could have gone under the radar. But also I think, for a lot of foreign media, they don't do specialized reporting on different countries. How many media have bureaus? How many foreign media have bureaus in South Korea? How many of them would be able to devote, like you said, that type of the resources towards something that sounds like a conspiracy theory?
That's right. And I think especially if you remember back in the old days of 15, 20 years ago, maybe longer, where, as you say, media used to have big offices throughout Asia, and they had people that they could just throw on a story like this. So it is there is some, that's part of the reason, to my way of thinking. But at the same time, even with available resources, I would suggest that this could have gotten more attention. And also, I would note that the people who've raised these issues, raised the allegations, they're all available to be talked to. That's one of the very interesting things about it, and it's a compelling piece of the puzzle, is that normally in these sorts of whodunits, nobody's really got much evidence. They won't show their work. But here you have everyone's willing to explain what they found and why and how they reached these conclusions. They put them out to be publicly examined and refuted if necessary. And so if somebody was just interested, one could go, bring your own statisticians, bring your own computer experts, your own cybersecurity people, and have them look at it and make their own conclusions. And if it's a different conclusion, fine, but that appears not to have been done. So that's the people, let's say the citizens have done their bit, and to try and present the case, present the information, and not surprisingly, the Moon administration hasn't taken up the challenge, but nor has the overseas media, and I'm not so sure how much government attention has been paid to this either.
So you say the citizens have done their bit, but like if you look at Belarus, which earlier this year had an election and widespread allegations of voter fraud, probably a little simpler, because it was kind of like, taking ballots out of a window, that kind of like maybe more simple election fraud. And I get that it's a little harder to believe that it would happen in South Korea versus Belarus. But like in Belarus, citizens were upset and they protested on the streets in huge numbers. But why aren't we seeing this in South Korea?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good point. It's, in Belarus, I think everyone knew exactly what was coming. They've had, so many years of experience with the guy running the show. And they were out en masse. And it's a good question, in part, and especially when you consider that after the Korean election, the opposition party, the leadership, actually announced they were not going to challenge the results. And that really makes you wonder. But when I look into it, when you look at the nature of the opposition party, if you get up to the very top, the top people are pretty darn close to the other party. I say, once you start digging into it, and then you have a number of politicians who are just relieved to have kept their jobs. But you will note that in the opposition group, that at least 25 losing candidates who saw what had happened when you have 40 districts that are lost by a hair, and every single one of them goes to the ruling party, that you had 25 candidates, losing candidates, who brought lawsuits. And after about a total of 137 or so lawsuits brought on this election. And normally it's 2 or 3. It's a very small number of suits that are brought, but this one did get sort of a much, much greater number of suits brought than they've ever seen before. So there was real suspicion and unhappiness about this. Also, the people who would have been inclined to get out in the street, particularly some of the religious groups that are not happy about this, that they've actually been prevented from going out en masse. The Moon administration has actually cracked down, and this was just a couple of weeks ago during a holiday. The Moon administration basically locked down central Seoul, using buses and police and stopping cars to make sure they didn't have protest flags. And their excuse was, well, that because of the coronavirus, they couldn't let people protest in central Seoul. But at the same time, just a few miles away, they allowed amusement parks to go full bore, with people cheek by jowl. And so there has been an effort made to keep, say, public protest from coming out. But at the same time, and as you note, it is a bit different than the Belarus situation. And a lot of people just generally, I think it is human nature that when, if your life isn't all that affected by something, you tend not to get out in the streets for it. And there is a tendency to, it takes a lot to get people out. And that is the feature of human nature. But and it is one of the puzzling things that, and even within the conservative movement, that there's a lot of people who just can't quite get the idea that an election was rigged. And you actually see that on the U.S. side as well. And partly it's that there's an aspect, as you touched on, that, well, it's South Korea. And everyone knows South Korea. It's a modern country, what, the 10th largest economy in the world. It has shiny skyscrapers. They're supposed to be our great friends, and they don't rig elections. It just can't happen. And it's a myopia of sorts that makes a lot of people not think about it. But there is, I'd say there would be more attention on this, even in Seoul, but the government has been, in Korea, but the government has been, as we noted, effective in sort of keeping the media sort of on a leash.
I'm just curious, for these, citizen investigators or statisticians or lawyers, people who've looked into this, is this data just publicly available for them? Like, when you talk about, the election, like the ballots being traveling from New York to Rochester to Buffalo, then down to Newark, that information is available to look at?
Yes, it is. The lawyers available and his guys are available to talk to. As I say, this is one of the unusual things of people who've alleged a conspiracy to rig an election. They've actually put all their information out for examination. As I said, if somebody wants to hire their own statisticians, their own experts to review it, this is an unusual case where it is doable.
Well, in making the comparison with Belarus, in Belarus, it's very clear that that is a dictatorship. And many of the things that you are saying the Moon administration has been up to, like stopping protests, silencing the media, that sounds like a dictatorship as well. But again, South Korea, this can't be a dictatorship. Can you tell us a bit more about the characteristics of the Moon administration?
Sure. It, if you live long enough, you kind of get a certain context. What's going on in South Korea reminds me of what went on in Turkey after Erdogan took over in the early 2000s, or Venezuela after Chavez took over, or if you're older, you remember when Ayatollah Khomeini was let back into Iran, and the Western commentariat fell all over itself, declaring he was just a sort of a pious religious guy that didn't really have any political interests or interest in transforming Iranian society. But what you're seeing in Korea, it reminds you of those sorts of things, and it's not that hard to figure out. But and what you've got, as I see it, is you have got a leftist government that is basically dominated by a radical coterie, a hardcore group of people who came out of the student activist movement in the 1970s and 1980s. And were basically pro-North Korea, pro-Marxist. I won't even use the word socialist, because that conjures up images of Sweden. But this is something at the very extreme end, who see the Americans as colonial occupiers and who think that China is who Korea ought to be close to. And it's this small group of committed radicals who have sort of not changed the way they think, but have now found themselves in power. And you say, well, how can that possibly be? And well, listen to what they say, look at their backgrounds, look at what they have said, and then find one of them who has renounced those ideas. And Moon is from that background. People think of him though as just a human rights lawyer and a liberal, but no, read what he has said. He's the guy who declared himself euphoric when he heard the Americans had been defeated in Vietnam. A person, if you really want to dig into this, and you can do it in a couple hours because there's so much excellent homework that has been done into this, is into the ideology of this small group surrounding Moon. And it's been done by Dr. Tara Oh of the East-West Research Center, and she has just done a wonderful job of digging into it, finding the transcripts, putting them into English as well. And you read some of the stuff that these people have said, and it is just astonishing. I'll just read one little bit, and this is by a gentleman who was Moon put as the justice minister for about a month until it collapsed in scandal, nepotism, financial wrongdoing, etc. But this guy, as a student back in the 80s, he had been the head of the Socialist Workers' League of Korea. And in one pamphlet that he wrote back then, this is what he said to the members of the group: "We will not leave behind even a drop of blood to struggle for the success of socialist revolution in South Korea for comrades, workers, farmers, and proletariat brothers. Comrades, place weapons in our hands to fight the enemy." And there's more to it, but it gets even, it's along those lines.
Well, let me interrupt for a second, because I think it, what I don't want to do is kind of make it like a witch hunt to go after people for ideology they had back in college. I mean, look, we all made mistakes in college. I mean, not me, obviously. But, okay, so these are things they said a long time ago. You say they haven't renounced it, but, like, I've never publicly renounced, mistakes I've made. Like, what is it now about the current policy of the current Moon Jae-in administration that makes them, like, it's still a democracy, right? Like, what is it that makes them anywhere like a dictatorship or like a kind of far left issue?
Probably in, like, how their relationship is with the United States, North Korea, and China.
Well, first, going back to that renouncing what they've said, I understand that idea as well. That, if we were all held to whatever we'd said when we were 20, that would not be a good thing. But once again, you look closely into what these people have said, and as I say, they have had the chance to say that they've changed their minds or that they were wrong, but it is so consistent to find these people, in the Moon administration, some figure like 30% of the staff in the Blue House, their equivalent of the White House, are from that background. And there are people who do not change their outlook and their objectives. But here's what when you look at what has happened to South Korea, and I think you've seen a systematic effort by the Moon administration to get control of and previous leftist administrations to get control of the key levers of society that'll let you control a society and a government. What would I point to? Well, the intelligence service is under Moon's thumb. The National Election Commission has over the years has gotten staffed by Moon's people. Or when I say Moon's people, I'm referring to also that larger, sort of more extreme left-wing group of people running the show. The judiciary, once again, seated with Moon's people. And I mentioned how the press has been brought under control as well. Very aggressive use of legal powers and coercion to go against the media. The military as well, which has often been considered sort of a break on South Korea going too far in the left direction. A few years ago, one of the top generals, a 4-star general, was brought up on really trumped-up charges of abuse of power, human rights violations, and corruption. This wasn't good. It also put the rest of the military on notice. So you've got the judiciary, you've got the military, you have the intelligence services, you have an effort that's been made recently to bring the prosecutors under control, bring them into line, to keep them from investigating wrongdoing in the Moon administration. The justice ministers, once again, from this group of committed radicals, and she has done what has been referred to as a so-called Saturday Night Massacre to rein in the prosecutors, and also to create a now they're going to have a special, like a special prosecutors group to go after high-level corruption, which sounds a lot like what the Chinese Communist Party has going as well. But the missing piece of all of this was the legislature, where there was a powerful opposition. So you get the control of these levers of power. And there's one that I didn't mention, and that is called the private sector. In China, in South Korea, of course, obviously there's an immensely powerful private sector. And the very good example of what's going on to try to get control of it is I'd say the persecution of Samsung, the big South Korean electronics company. And that has just been under constant assault of allegations of corruption, just investigation after investigation, putting the top guys in prison, etc. And then to force in and what you see in the big companies is an effort to force in labor union groups, in fact, almost like the old communist workers' councils, to get these in to some of the big private companies, and once again to intimidate, to dominate that.
Well, couldn't it be that, for instance, Samsung, there was corruption?
Well, there always is corruption. This is Korea, after all. If you want to look for something, you can find it. But once again, if you look into the specifics of what has been done, and once again, I would cite Dr. Oh's work on this, that if you look into it, you realize that this is more than just normal prosecutorial activity to keep things fair. And there's an aspect of persecution, and I think it is an effort to accumulate power to turn South Korea into really a one-party state for the foreseeable future. One gentleman I spoke with referred to it as a quasi-totalitarian.
So I want to bring this back to China. And before we look at the allegations that China may have been involved in this election somehow, let's first talk about China policy. What is the Moon Jae-in administration's China policy compared to the previous administration, the Park administration, I believe? What's changed in that relationship, or what's China's interest?
Well, China's interest has always been to get the U.S. off the Korean Peninsula. China's interest in not just in Korea but all over the place is to split U.S. alliances, break them up, and then you can go after what's left. But that's their long-term interest. And of course, a Korea, unified or not, that is under Chinese domination. That if you play out the knock-on effects from that, it would upset the entire security situation today, from our perspective, in Northeast Asia, and it would be felt regionally and globally if you had the U.S.-South Korea alliance collapse. As I noted, most South Koreans do still value this relationship with the United States, and to include the military relationship. But within the sort of a chunk of Korean society, and particularly manifest in the new administration and that coterie of committed radicals, that they do see the Americans as colonialists. They see the Japanese as their front men, and they see the Americans as the problem that keeps Korea separated, keeps the two Koreas apart. So without the Americans there, it would be possible to unify, and then the people would be together again, and then the natural alignment of Korea would be with China, with whom some have on that side have said they share a common destiny. There will always be, of course, an angle to all of this that Korea is has always been at a certain relationship with China and with Japan. It's sort of the expression of what a shrimp in between two whales fighting. So Korea has always had a sort of a difficult time trying to preserve itself and its independence. But once with the current administration, I believe that the people that I've been talking about, that they would see a very close relationship with China as desirable, and ideally to not have the Americans around anymore. But that's something most Koreans don't want, but these people can't exactly say exactly what they intend, but I think that is a reasonable supposition on my part.
See, I don't understand this because the U.S. is essentially the U.S.'s presence is allowing South Korea to not be a tribute state to China. So, look, what's the motivation for wrecking for the Moon administration? You say that they're leftists and they want to get rid of the Americans, but like that seems to me to be a crazy idea that would make it harder for any South Korean administration to be independent.
Matt is the American imperialist in the team, obviously.
Yeah, and you guys are my running dogs. Is that how it works?
It does. I've got a dunce cap here, a placard that I'm going to send you. But you've looked at it exactly like we would. When I say we, like Americans, is that to us it's very obvious. Look, we keep Korea safe. We fought the Korean War with the Koreans, and to keep them free. And if we weren't there, North Korea would be down in a second, and China would be able to throw its weight around. That's how we would see it. There's a logic to it. It's actually probably true, but not everyone sees it that way. And you do have, as I say, as part of the Korean electorate and the top of the political class that sees it completely opposite. That sees America as the problem, and the issue is always been, well, how many Koreans, South Koreans, think that, and can they do anything about it? And that's one of the reasons for sort of leaving it sort of unaddressed. Is just sort of hope for the best, hope things work out, hope that more sort of level-headed South Koreans take over. It's a strategy, I suppose, but it's a strategy of not doing much and ignoring a potential problem, sort of a rot that's set in. But I think if looked at from the perspective of once again, anti-American, anti-fascist, you could call it socialist worker, student activist of the 70s and 80s, that from their perspective, that America is the problem. And the only thing that keeps the South and the North from getting together is the American refusal to sign a treaty ending the war, their refusal, and really give the North what it wants, what it needs, which is what the Moon administration says the North needs to draw them into an alliance, to an agreement. But it's the Americans that are seen as the problem by some people. That probably would say, I don't think it's true, of course, but depending on your perspective and your mindset, that's the view. And the question, as I mentioned, is how far are they going to be able to take that? Same thing, once again, go back to Turkey and Venezuela. How the changes sometimes seem so imperceptible that there's even less reason to do anything about it. And then one day things have gotten to the point that you've really got the problem on your hands.
Has the Moon administration done specific things to move closer to China?
Well, they have. One good example of that is the anti-missile defense system that the Americans put in 2016, put into Korea to really protect American troops, but also to protect South Korea. The Chinese went berserk, and for no good reason, but that's what they did. And they applied immense economic pressure on South Korea to the point that the big South Korean company Lotte had to close down over 100 shops. In South Korea, Samsung also was affected and has closed down some of their Chinese operations, as well South Korean or Chinese tourists stopped going to South Korea. So it was an immense economic sort of hit that South Korea took when that missile defense system was put in. But Moon went too far in the other direction. What he did, he went to China and told them, okay, no more THAAD, batteries, and there won't be a missile defense system in South Korea, and we will never have a three-way alliance with the Americans, the Japanese, and the South Koreans. This is the so-called three no's that was pulled off. It was a real blow. It was pulled off without any notice, and a real blow to some Americans who didn't expect it. But that was going pretty far. Then you had, when the coronavirus, when it hit, that Moon did not follow the advice of everybody and closed the borders. He kept them open to Chinese tourists, Chinese travelers, during the whole thing, or until much too late. And he stated, well, we're going to suffer together with China. He's gone to China and he's made speeches which, even considering what leaders say in foreign countries, it really just went way too far, and that's caused a lot of concern. And once again, there is that sort of Marxist, pro-communist ideology which these guys have had from the beginning. They don't trumpet it, but once again, they have when they've had the chance to say, "Boy, what were we thinking?" They have very carefully just kept their mouths shut and not said anything.
Well, so it's clear then that the Chinese Communist Party would have a motivation to perhaps help the Moon administration win an election. But what evidence is there that China actually played a role in an alleged rigging the election?
I'll sort of make the case or present the evidence that I've been able to find.
And you are coming from a law background, so...
That's right, yeah. Like 2 out of every 3 Americans, I'm a lawyer. You sometimes think to get a passport from America, you need to be a lawyer. There's so many of us, but you are sort of careful not to get too far ahead of your skis. To not overreach, but to try and look at the evidence and see how compelling it is and put it together. And so here's how I would lay it out. Is one of the principal allegations is that the election was electronically rigged, that it was hacked, and in other words, the electoral network was manipulated, and the belief is that there was Chinese involvement in it. First off, it's worth remembering that the South Korean electoral network is pretty simple. Whereas we have an extremely complex one going down to the county level that each kind of do their own thing, and there's just almost thousands of little computer networks that you have to get and navigate to try and do something with it. In South Korea's case, effectively what you have is with the National Election Commission, one server, or a big server, the NEC server, and that connects to every polling site. And that's about all it is. It's pretty easy to understand. So if you can get into the election network, then you have access to the voters' lists, the voting machines, or the vote counting machines, everything. Imagine if I was one of these guys who hacks for a living, but I'd probably find this a pretty juicy target and not think it all that complicated. The network design is pretty simple. And then you look at what the network is made of, and you've got, say, the server with the voting connected to each site with the voting machines, the counting machines, and the telecom company that provides the communications equipment for this thing is called LGU+. That's a Korean telecom company. It uses all sorts of equipment made by Huawei, the Chinese telecom company that is an arm of the Chinese Communist Party's surveillance apparatus, and that the Americans and a number of other countries have gone to great lengths to try and get them out, Huawei equipment out of their systems. It's notable that LGU Plus has refused to join the American so-called clean network, or that they're going to put together globally that is sort of clean of Chinese hardware. LG Plus doesn't want to be part of that. The Moon administration doesn't want to make them be part of it, saying, well, it's a private company, they can make their own decisions. So here you have, in the network, you have Huawei equipment and a company that is well disposed towards Huawei. In fact, LGU Plus's former president is now an advisor for Huawei. Apparently has been since 2017. So that's a problem. Let's say it's, you have the vulnerability there. Additionally, at each polling site, you have what are called electronic counting machines. And these collect and count the ballots. And in each machine, there's a laptop computer as part of the package. Well, these computers there's LG Gram laptops. And this too there's a very serious concern about that. They're assembled in the PRC. Once again, Huawei concerns, but even if it wasn't Huawei, just having something this sensitive assembled in the People's Republic of China as a problem. This, of course, is not proof of anything, but it does indicate some real vulnerability. But when you look at the National Election Commission's reaction when they were challenged on this by citizens, is regarding the possibility of the system being hacked. They said, well, it's a dedicated network, hacking is impossible. Well, that speaks for itself. Additionally, when asked about Huawei and Huawei equipment, hardware in the system, they said Chinese Huawei is irrelevant. That's it. So why go to some those hacker conventions in Vegas and make say those two things, and you probably couldn't hear yourself for all the laughter. But that was their answer. So that once again gets your attention. Now then you had before in July 2019, so 9 months before the election or so, one of President Moon's closest advisors, and he's the head of the Democratic Party's official think tank, which is responsible for winning elections. He goes to the People's Republic of China, and he signed an operation agreement with the Chinese Central School. He takes with him an assembly member from the Democratic Party, who was also the Moon's deputy campaign manager for the 2017 election. In addition to signing this agreement, they also visit Tencent, the big data company in China. So they do that, and keep in mind that Moon's close advisor, when he was in college, he was the leader of the Struggle Committee for Anti-American Independence, Anti-Fascism, Democratization. And it kind of gives you an idea of where his sympathies lie. So these guys go to China, sign an agreement with the Central Party School, meet up with Tencent, and then a couple of weeks later, a prominent Chinese AI guy, he comes to Seoul and he meets with Moon's people, and they talk about the upcoming election. Once again, that kind of gets your attention, to see that happen. It has been alleged that Tencent and other Chinese companies helped with the pre-election big data analysis, which is very helpful for giving a sense of how things look. But I'm a lawyer, so I of course don't understand big data, other than to know that if used right, it can be very effective. Additionally, there's evidence, and there's documentary evidence, that on some of there's ballot papers that have language misspelled, and it's spelled in the way that a Chinese Korean would have written it. The language for the congressional election, it's misspelled, and no Korean would make that mistake. Additionally, you had Chinese nationals serving as poll watchers during the election. This too is verified. And then in all of this, there's been no forensic examination done on the software, the hardware, really the allegations that have been made. Nobody's really challenged these, other than to dismiss them as conspiracy theories and fake news, while the Moon administration uses legal powers and its coercive powers against the people who brought these charges. And that's is when you talk about the Chinese involvement. It is a circumstantial case, but when you look at but nonetheless, it gets one's attention, particularly what we know of Chinese hacking and Chinese computer intrusions and theft and manipulation throughout the world, and even as it's affected us. So that, and then you consider motivation, access, and technical expertise. If you're making the case is, if your motivation, what's your motivation for helping Moon manipulate an election? So he gets 180 seats out of 300, now has enough to pass any legislation he wants. He now has the ability to revise the Constitution if he can just get 3 more votes. And with this, you've given Moon is the last remaining big piece of power, or the lever of authority that you need. So that would be a nice motivation for doing it, to eventually get the Americans off the peninsula. And recall, but would the Chinese really do that? Recall what the Chinese did in the Taiwan election in 2018 and 2020. There was very aggressive cyber activity. I don't know about manipulating vote counts as are alleged in South Korea, but they certainly in 2018 were able to mobilize the internet or the social media to take their favorite candidate in the Kaohsiung mayoral election and put him on top to an overwhelming victory. And they tried to do the same thing to undercut President Tsai in 2020, but Taiwan was wise to it, and also the crackdown in Hong Kong didn't help either. The Chinese have tried to split alliances throughout Asia, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, etc. So there's a motivation to maybe try and say rig the election, manipulate it. In terms of access, once again we've seen. To me, that you've got enough sort of pro-China people in the Moon administration that you just need enough to get you into the network and to work the system, work the algorithms to allocate votes as you need them. So access really not all that hard. All you need really are the codes to get in, and once you're there, I'm a believer in what the Chinese cyber people can do. In terms of technical expertise, once again, that speaks for itself. The Chinese were able to get into our OPM net, the Office of Personnel Management network a few years ago, and steal just about the entire database. They're pretty good at it. And one last bit that I didn't mention is one of the mathematicians, these guys that I talked to in South Korea. He makes a case, and he's looked into. Thinks he's figured out the algorithm as to how the election was manipulated, and he claims to have found within the data, sort of hidden away, as he calls it, an Easter egg, like I guess hackers do to broadcast their work, or it's the little Kilroy was here sort of narrative. He found what he says is the expression "follow the party," and which he tracked. Says China would be Chinese, but the thing is, he's willing to present his information. He's willing to explain himself and why he got there and how he found that. So that's the sort of trying to think through the prospect or the possibility of actual PRC involvement. Once again, it's not a smoking gun, but certainly some smoke there to my way of thinking.
So we'll just have to wait for the South Korean media to investigate.
After they all get out of jail.
or foreign media as well. Why not? Or I would suggest that even on the U.S. side, the government side, with their $80 billion intelligence budget a year, you'd think they would just devote like a little bit of that $80 billion to looking into this.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if they did, we would not know about it.
That's true. Well, so yeah, it's like you say, there is no smoking gun, but there are certainly a lot of red flags in this election that seem to deserve a bit more investigation than they're getting.
We're also starting to get, recently we've seen a little more interest in the possibility of cyber influencing an election. ASPI, the Australian think tank, just the other day put out a report on cyber targeting of elections worldwide. They didn't mention this particular one in South Korea, but they did mention supposed North Korean hackers trying to get at some North Korean defectors running for office in South Korea. I think they missed a good story there. Additionally, the Department of Homeland Security in the U.S. has issued warnings of Chinese and other countries getting right into the electoral systems. They haven't been as specific as they ought to be. Even Foreign Policy magazine, just the other day, issued another thing on cyber attacks on elections. But also, one thing that's not gotten much attention is not long ago, a couple of years ago maybe, the Senate Intelligence Committee in the U.S. issued a report on Russian involvement in the 2016 election from a cyber perspective, and a lot of it's blacked out. But what isn't is very interesting because it actually describes how Russian cyber people did a very extensive reconnaissance of U.S. Electoral systems right down to the county level. Almost you could imagine them getting into these school cafeterias where the voting machines are. But it was so thorough and so detailed and down in the weeds that one would be, I think, ill-advised to suspect that only the Russians could or would do that. So once again, there seems to be some interest being paid in the possibility of actually digitally manipulating an election. There's also a very good article the other day in Newsweek by D.D. Kirsten Tutlow that talks about Chinese influence operations to shape the U.S. election and beyond. She doesn't get into the actual cyber hacking, but she does get into the cyber social media influencing. But you think about it at the end of the day, when I think about it, I think, well, people will hack everything. We're told to constantly be on our guard about computer thieves and computer criminals getting at us. And yet, when it comes to hacking an election, nobody seems to think that's possible. And yet, when you have a case like South Korea, where you've got some information that's been dug up, you have motivation, access, expertise, one would think would get a little more attention than it's gotten. The information's there. And there has been a bit written on it. We've done a report on it. But also, I would once again mention Dr. Tara Oh, the East-West Research Center, who's done excellent work on this. She's covered the election as well. She's covered most of what I've talked about also, and is a very sober observer of things, South Korean and Chinese.
Well, Grant, thank you for joining us today and helping us shed a little bit of light on this topic.
A pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Wow, well, that's a pretty big story. I can't believe no media is covering it.
I can believe that they're not covering it.
I mean, I think it just requires so much resources to investigate that, and then plus the suppression, as you pointed out, of the media in South Korea because of their, overbearing
3 to 7
libel
years
laws.
in jail.
Yeah. So, but I mean, it's just one of those things where we don't know what happened, and there's really not the smoking gun to support any of these allegations. So it does require some serious investigation. And that's the part that's really not happening.
Well, we can put a link to the piece he wrote for the Center for Security Policy.
Yeah, we'll have that down below.
That kind of goes through all of the evidence, more in detail. But yeah, I think you can't say that there's conclusive evidence either way, and probably we'll never know.
Well, I mean, we won't know if we'll never know if people never investigate. And it seems like people won't investigate unless there's a smoking gun. But you can't know there's a smoking gun unless you investigate. Funny.
Right.
Well, anyways, thank you again for joining us on this episode of China Unscripted. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
We'll talk to you next time.